Welcome to the Reading the Mind in the Eyes test revised version, a study with normal adults and adults with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism, or the Baron Cohen et al. Review. This video will have me writing down parts of the study while also doodling to help with attention. You can follow along, but it's obviously optional. Also, if I'm going too fast in this video or my handwriting is just bad, there will be a recap at the very end. Before we get into the study, I'll go over the cognitive approach and how it applies to Baron Cohen. The cognitive approach describes how we mentally represent the world. One strength of the cognitive approach is that it's central to understanding behaviors. Another strength is that it studies problem solving and memory, which are key to human experience. In this case, studying the ability to read social cues from eyes. A weakness is that it's reductionist as it doesn't account for physical or emotional variables. In this case, only physical eyes are visible in the RET, which leaves out posture, facial expressions, and etc. To begin, we'll be looking at the psychology being investigated in Baron Cohen, the autism spectrum, which is a range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech, and nonverbal communication. The spectrum refers to the relative severity of the autistic traits in a person. And theory of mind, aka social intelligence, which is the ability to attribute mental stages to oneself or others. This concept overlaps with empathy. There are two stages to theory of mind. The first one is attribution of relevant mental state and inferring the content of the relevant mental state. In other words, they're recognizing a person's emotion and inferring what that emotion means.
Theory of mind, and this is taken from the introduction of the primary source. Theory of mind is shorthand for the ability to attribute mental states to oneself or another person. He also refers to the notion of theory of mind, Baron Cohen does, as other terms such as mentalizing or mind reading, and he also mentions that it overlaps with the term empathy. So that's an easier way to describe theory of mind. They're not quite perfect synonyms, but they are quite similar.
For the background of Baron Cohen, we need to know two acronyms which are in the autism spectrum disorder. These acronyms are AS, which stands for Asperger's syndrome, which is on the severe end of the spectrum, and HFA, which stands for high functioning autism, which is on the less severe end of the spectrum. The issue behind the study is that there used to be no tests available for adults with mild deficits in social understanding, especially if their intelligence is normal, as may be the case with AS or HFA people. The bottom line is that tests need to be more sensitive. The measure or psychometric for this study before we get to the RET is the AQ, or the Autism Spectrum Quotient, which measures the degree to which any adult with normal IQ possesses traits related to the autism spectrum, which is a self-report questionnaire with scores ranging from 0 to 50. The higher the score, the more autistic traits which are represented in the person taking the test. So this is the autism spectrum disorder, where there are 3 levels. Level 1, which is needs support, patient's social and communication skills and repetitive behaviors are only noticeable without support. So this would be the HFA, their less severe autism. And then level 2, in the middle, needs substantial support. Their patient's social and communication skills and repetitive behaviors are still obvious to an observer, even with support in place. And severe autism, which is level 3. This would be the Asperger's syndrome, more severe side, and they need very substantial support. Patients' social and communication skills and repetitive behaviors are severely impaired daily life. When the study is referring to impairment, it's focusing on theory of mind, which impact this impairment triad, which have social communication, social interaction, and repetitive behaviors, all mixing up to be the autism spectrum. And social sensitivity and theory of mind really play into these 3 things, and that's why they're important to the study. In 1997, Baron Cohen also developed the old AICE test. However, it had a number of problems. The first issue was that on the test there were only 2 options per question, which made it a 50-50 chance to get the answer right. The old test had a very narrow range of scores, which had caused ceiling effects. Some questions used basic emotions or asked the direction that the eyes were focusing at, which made the test way too easy. And some answer choice foils were opposites of the correct answer, so it made it very obvious which one was correct. Also, participants who took the old test were not given a glossary, so they may not have understood some of the words. These issues led to a less sensitive reading the mind in the eyes test. A list of improvements in 2001 came with a new test that was more sensitive and that was used in the current study. The new test came with an increase from 2 to 4 answer options, an increase from 25 to 36 questions. Only more complex emotions were used, an equal amount of male and female faces, because on the old test, it actually had more female faces. The 3 foil options were similar in valence to the target answer, which meant they seemed similar to the actual answer, so that it wasn't so obvious. And there was a glossary provided this time. Later on, I'll go into the developmental process that went into this test. Okay, so this was the old AICE test, and you can see it only would really have 2 options, and they were very opposites. It would be pretty easy to tell which one was the correct answer and which one was wrong here. And compared to the new 2001 revised AICE test, there would be 4 different answers, and it wouldn't be as obvious because a lot of these answers are as close to the correct one. So it's going to be apologetic, friendly, uneasy, or dispirited. In this case, the answer would be uneasy. This would have been another example of the old test, which had only 2 options again, but this time it was like directional, so it would be way too easy to guess what the correct answer is here. And you can see why there were ceiling effects. This one's obviously ignoring you. Compared to the new test, there'd be just 4 options once again, and they were all similar to the correct answer, but it would be kind of hard to tell. This one would be decisive, amused, aghast, or bored, and in this case, the correct answer would be decisive. In Baron Cohen, there are 3 aims for the study. The first one being to investigate a group of adults with AS or HFA on the revised AICE test, or the RET, to see if the results were replicated. Since the goal of the new test is to reduce ceiling effects through creating a more sensitive test, they wanted to see if the new test was more sensitive. For the second aim, it was to investigate if there is a negative correlation in a sample of normal adults between the RET and the autism quotient, which means as one score goes up, the other one would go down. Finally, the third aim was to investigate gender differences in the RET, since in the original test, it was found to show female superiority, which means they scored higher on the RET. The sample in Baron Cohen is very large, and it's composed of 4 different groups that came from the UK. The participants were recruited via opportunity or volunteer sampling. Group 1 was the AS or HFA group, which consisted of 15 male adults who were volunteering after they saw an ad in the UK National Autistic Society magazine. Group 2 was considered a control from the general population. It had 122 adults in educational classes from Exeter or from the Public Library of Cambridge. There were 55 males and 67 females in this group. They all had mixed occupation and level of education. Group 3 was another control group which had students of Cambridge in it. It had 103 undergrad students with 53 male and 50 female. Group 4 was the IQ match controls, which were 14 random adults who were IQ matched with the AS/HFA group. This group existed to create a more controlled comparison between normal adults and AS/HFA adults.
Generalizability is high because of the number of students. Now, of course, they're all from a similar region, so it's not exactly great, but it is a lot of people, hundreds of people.
This study's primary research method was experimental, and some questionnaires were used. The experimental design for this study was independent measures design because different groups were tested separately to compare their results. The independent variables were the four groups, whether it be the AS or the HFA or the other three control groups. Whether the participant was male or female was also an independent variable. The dependent variables for this study were the RET scores, the AQ scores, and the gender identification for the AS/HFA group. They were asked to judge the gender of the person in the image. Later in the procedure section, I'll explain why they were asked to do this. The development of the revised AICE test was important as it helped to ensure increased reliability and validity. There were 8 judges consisting of 4 female and 4 male on the piloting of the test, and they were asked to judge the photos and their respective target correct answers. At least 5 judges had to agree with the correct answer. No more than 2 could have picked a foil question, and the answers were piloted over and over again until this criteria was met to ensure that the answers were as accurate as possible. Here I have the appendix for the study, which is every question and all the 4 options. As you can see, these words are generally much larger and a lot more complex than just directional or 2-option questions. Some words like aghast, despondent, incredulous, sarcastic, bewildered, skeptical. These words are larger and more complex and can be way more sensitive in a test that's meant to test for theory of mind. Since the participants were given a glossary, these complex words weren't really a cause for concern. There were 5 hypotheses in this study. The first hypothesis was that the AS/HFA group would score significantly lower on the RET than the control group for it, which would mean they would lack theory of mind. The second hypothesis was that the AS/HFA group would score significantly higher on the AQ, which would mean they have more autistic traits. The third hypothesis is that females in control groups 2 and 3 would score higher than males on the RET. This was because in the original test there was female superiority. The fourth hypothesis was that males in the Cambridge group would score higher than females on the AQ, which is basically the opposite, as they would show more autistic traits. And the final hypothesis was that scores on the AQ and the RET would be negatively correlated, so as there were more autistic traits, there would be less theory of mind. The apparatus in this study was a paper and pencil revised AICE test with black and white photos, and this test was given to all groups. The first groups to be tested were the control Cambridge and the general population groups. They had the original 40 photo revised AICE test. However, researchers, when looking at the data, chose to eliminate 4 items from the test, which left only 36 items to ultimately represent the data. These 4 questions were removed because either less than 50% of the subjects got the target word or more than 25% picked the wrong answer. The AS/HFA and the IQ match groups were the second to take the test, and each test was administered in a quiet room at either Cambridge or Exeter. The AS/HFA group had to judge the gender of each photo as a control task. This was meant to show the researchers that they had the ability to discern facial cues. Participants in Group 1, 3, and 4 completed the AQ. Some of the Group 2 participants never turned in the AQ. Participants were asked to use the glossary or ask for help if they did not understand a term. This helped to eliminate extraneous variables. This study did relatively well with the ethics. All participants consented and were aware of the nature of the research. The only real ethical concern was that participants may have felt stressed out during the test if they struggled with some of the questions. All the data was anonymous, so that an individual could not be identified by their scores. This was good for confidentiality. Overall, this study was fairly ethical.
I don't see a deception. I don't see any sort of distress. All right, having someone take a test. I know that students find it stressful, but it's really not. Sticking you in a box with a snake.
So here is the table from the study for the scores from each group on each question for the revised AICE test. And as you can see, for almost every single question, the AS/HFA adults scored way lower than the rest of the groups, with the group 4 control scoring really high relative to all of the other ones. My guess is because this has less people, so there were just higher scores, and these are larger samples. But relative to the AS/HFA group, these groups scored way higher, which reflected their increased ability to have theory of mind, and it also showed how group 1, the AS/HFA group, were impaired. Okay, so these were the results at the very end of the study. So we have all 4 groups, their RET scores and their AQ scores. And you can see here that the AS/HFA group scored relatively high on the AQ score, which showed that they were more likely to have autistic traits, and they scored lower than the rest of the groups in the RET, which showed that they were less likely to have theory of mind. And all the other groups seemed to score higher on this than the AS/HFA group, and they scored lower, which showed that they probably had less autistic traits. And this showed that the tests were more sensitive. It could pick up the differences in these groups. Some participants didn't finish the AQ, so that's why this is not here, but you could assume that it would probably be around this amount, or like 20. All hypotheses were supported by this, and these were all taken from paper-pencil questionnaires. The quantitative data from the chart showed 6 different results. The first is that the AS/HFA group scored significantly lower than the other groups on the RET, which supported the first hypothesis. The second result was that on the AQ, the AS/HFA group scored significantly higher than the Cambridge and the IQ matched groups, which supported hypothesis 2. Females scored higher on the RET, but not significantly. However, it still supported hypothesis 3. Males scored higher on the AQ, but not significantly either, and that still supported hypothesis 4. There was a significant negative correlation between the AQ scores and the RET scores, which supported hypothesis 5. This meant that as autistic traits went up, theory of mind went down, and vice versa. And finally, there was no correlation found between the AICE test and IQ, or between the AQ and IQ. In conclusion, the current 2001 study replicated the findings of the original test, that AS/HFA adults were significantly impaired in identifying social interaction cues. The study also confirmed that AS/HFA adults scored significantly higher on the AQ tests than control groups. The modifications enabled the RET to be more sensitive in measuring social intelligence. This showed that the RET was useful in identifying subtle impairment in theory of mind related to the autism spectrum or high-functioning autism. The researchers in this study also included that gender differences would have likely been significant if the sample were only larger. The study is relatively strong. One strength is that it has a large sample with quantitative data, which helps to show a correlation or a cause and effect relationship. The RET is really easy to replicate and administer since it's just a paper and pencil test. This improves reliability. Another strength of the study is the pilot AICE test development and evaluation of target words and foils. This helped to improve the validity of the test itself. The study also had a lack of ethical concerns. This study also had experimental validity, as all groups took the RET and the AQ, so that they can be compared on the same set scale. Since the study was in an experimental testing environment, there were a few weaknesses. The first weakness is that the test lacks ecological validity since it was done in a testing room, which is different from the everyday context of a social encounter. Another weakness is that it lacks mundane realism, since looking at photos of still eyes is nothing like an actual social setting. And finally, since the study used self-report measures, participants may still have had social desirable answers or misunderstood some of the questions.
In particular, ecological validity. When you talk about ecological validity, it goes hand in hand with mundane realism. And again, we're not asked to look at static images and attribute mental states. However, if my friend Jimmy walks in and he's got tears rolling down his face, I'm going to attribute a mental state. Whereas I'm flipping through a magazine, I'm not going to quite do it as often. So the AQ seems to be quite valid, and the AICE test seems to be quite valid in judging who is autistic and who may not be autistic. So validity is sort of like a middle of the road type of thing.
A photo of just still black and white eyes can look very different from what an actual social setting would look like, such as this. The reality of discerning social cues from something like this would be completely different from something like this. This study has a couple applications. Schools could use the findings to help students with AS/HFA with extra support in understanding complex emotions and in reading faces. And therapists can help people with AS/HFA to improve social and emotional skills.
Application, I think, is high because these are tools that psychologists could use or that you could use yourself if you're worried about a friend or yourself having some sort of social impairment, and they're readily available. Both the AQ and the AICE test are readily available online.
The book noted that for issues and debates, this study doesn't exactly add to nature versus nurture. However, this study does add to the individual versus situational debate, since on the individual side, there were clear differences between AS/HFA group and the control group, which were evident and show that the AS/HFA group lacked theory of mind. While on the situational side, the glossary provided may have helped the participant to understand complex emotions and improved scores. Baron Cohen definitely leans towards the individual side of this argument, as there were clear differences between these participants. The participants actively taking a paper and pencil test like this would be not even close to an actual social interaction like this. This glaring weakness in Baron Cohen has inspired some possible improvements for research in the future. For more evaluation, there can be improvements and suggestions for future research in this topic. For example, a new test could be made that has dynamic photos instead of just still photos or just black and white photos, so that it would be more like the real world. In a new study, researchers could measure the speed of the responses to account for more individual differences between participants. And randomizing the items in the test may help to reduce order effects as well. Okay, so here were some points to remember in Baron Cohen. First, it was the cognitive approach. It investigated social impairment in people within the autism spectrum. The old test was not as sensitive. It was way too easy, again, because of the two options, the directional answers and the very opposite target answers. The new test had more options and was more complex, which just made it more sensitive. The RET and the AQ used to measure theory of mind and autistic traits, respectively. Those were the self-report questionnaires. The sample was British. They came from Britain. They were in mainly the Cambridge group, the general populace, the AS/HFA people, and the IQ matched group for the AS/HFA. And they were either volunteer or opportunity. The study is independent measures design as its experimental design. For the test development, at least 5 judges had to agree with the correct answer, and a maximum of 2 could disagree. If it was above that, then the answer would be, or the question would be repiloted, and the choices would be changed up until it met this criteria. So that made the test more accurate. All hypotheses were supported, all 5 of them. the AICE/HFA were significantly impaired in theory of mind and social sensitivity. The study was strong because it had a large sample of quantitative data and was easy to replicate and pretty reliable because it was just a paper and pencil test. And it was weak because it did lack mundane realism and ecological validity, because this test would not even be comparable to a social encounter. And also the self-report problems, which were the social desirability bias or possibly misunderstanding some questions. Overall, it'd be ideal to know everything from the study, but these points are the very least that you can know and are pretty important for Baron Cohen. So I have the grave here, and it's all here summarized for Baron Cohen for those scary 10-point evaluation questions. So first, we have generalizability. It's pretty decent because there is a large sample. There are 4 groups and hundreds of participants, and they all were diverse in what they did and who they were and their general intelligence levels. However, there were no females in the AS/HFA group, which could hurt generalizability, and you could mention that. And also, they were only in Britain, which was not very culturally generalizable. But overall, it was still pretty decent for generalizability. It's pretty good for reliability, as they were standardized AQ and RET measures, and they were really easy to administer and replicate since, again, they were just a paper and pencil test. For application, it's pretty good because both questionnaires are available online and you can use them to test for autistic traits. And it also showed that AS/HFA people may need extra support with these complex emotion reading and theory of mind related social interactions. Validity was the probably worst part about this study, and it was because of the ecological validity, because once again the tests were just, they don't represent a real interaction in real life. But the AQ and the RET were still pretty valid in what they were trying to measure, so it is middle of the road. For ethics, it was pretty good because consent was given, and the test could have possibly been stressful, but in reality that it wasn't really that stressful. Overall, this study was very, very strong. The first blanks were the autism spectrum and theory of mind, aka social intelligence. For background, the blanks were ASD, AS, HFA. The test needed to be more sensitive, and the higher the score, the more the autistic traits. With the old test, it was a 50-50 chance, and the narrow range of scores caused ceiling effects. For the new test, it increased from 2 to 4 options, and increased from 25 to 36 questions, and all the options were similar in valence. One of the aims was to investigate if there is a negative correlation, and the original test showed female superiority. In the sample, Group 1 was the AS/HFA group, Group 2 was the general population, Group 3 was students of Cambridge, and Group 4 were the IQ-matched controls. The research method was experimental, and the design was independent measures design. In the test's development, at least 5 judges had to agree with the correct answer, and no more than 2 could have picked a foil. In the hypotheses section, it would be the AS/HFA group would score significantly lower on the RET. AS/HFA group would score significantly higher on the AQ. Females in the control groups would score higher than males on the RET. Males in the Cambridge group would score higher than females on the AQ, and scores on the AQ and the RET would be negatively correlated. The apparatus was a paper and pencil test, and the control Cambridge and general population had the original 40-atom revised size test. In procedures, the AS/HFA group were asked to judge the gender of each photo, and participants were asked to use the glossary if they didn't understand something. All participants gave their consent. All the hypotheses were supported for the results, which were H1, H2, H3, H4, and H5. It was concluded that the AS/HFA group were significantly impaired in social interaction cues and that the RT was more sensitive. The large sample alongside the quantitative data helped to show a correlation. The study lacked mundane realism. The study's findings could be applied to schools and therapists. And finally, it was that the AS/HFA group lacked theory of mind.